Hello Bits and Bones, my name is Lady V, and welcome to my channel. After going back and talking about the article that I wrote that was called What is Overly Poetic Poetry, I thought it might also be fun to go back and revisit an article that I wrote called Instapoetry is a Necessary Evil. Since I wrote both of those, my perspective on poetry and the amount that I've consumed has definitely changed, but I thought it might be prudent to take a look at the other side of poetry, whereas in my last video I talked about poetry that is overly complex and therefore not easily accessible or really even enjoyable for me personally to consume. There's the other side of the spectrum with Instapoetry, which is just so plain and made to be so accessible that it doesn't really say much and it doesn't say it well. So I thought I'd read you this article that I wrote about Instapoetry and contextualize how I feel about both sides of the spectrum before we get farther into the channel where I talk about my actual tastes in poetry to help you better understand why I think some things are good and some things are bad, and that both ends of the spectrum of poetry are neither good. It's not like one end is good and one end is bad. It's the middle ground that's actually good, and not so much everything on either side of it. So here we go. Instapoetry is a necessary evil, a more understanding look at Rupi Kaur's poetry. To many writers of the pre-2000s, poetry felt like something in which they were not allowed to partake. As writers, we tend to lean towards literary forms considered profitable and of renown in today's climate. Poetry was always a bit taboo, something only handled by the greats, that had already proved their worth through other means. In that, poetry had a stigma, an untouchable air about it. If someone couldn't read your poetry and write a several-page essay on the symbolism and rhyme, was it even poetry? Poetry has always been largely stigmatized, by the professors that teach it to the eager literary scholars that refuse to indulge in it. Poetry was a literary bubble, so to speak. You either fit neatly inside it, or you popped it and gave everyone else dirty looks. That was, of course, until Instapoetry. Poetic hierarchy. Instapoetry broke the bubble poetry once inhabited. It is no longer prestigious or unattainable to the masses. Poetry became mainstream. Free verse flooded social media and inspired a resurgence in poetic interest. With this new wave, however, came an expected backlash. As something that had once enforced a degree of professionalism degraded to a form easily digestible on social media, scholars who had sectioned poetic merit as either this or that were understandably miffed. Even I want to say, wait, no, that doesn't count as poetry, does it? It's not ruins, it's just mainstream. If you are someone who opposed the introduction of Instapoetry, I have good news. Poetry hasn't been lost to simplification, it's gained a new form. Every form of media has gone through this transformation, and it was only a matter of time before poetry did the same. As I mentioned, classical poetry in many ways didn't feel accessible with its flamboyant words and enforced meter. Something supposed to be inspired by raw emotion and imagery was drowned in the process, making sure lines fit and syllables added up. Free verse, slam poetry, and Instapoetry each met their own backlash, and each preceded the other in success as they opened accessibility of poetry to the masses. Rejecting Instapoetry is the wrong path. As much as I believe all literary content should be held to the standards of its greatest to some degree, I would like to make a case for Instapoetry. For every one-liner that's little more than a fact and has no emotional or symbolic meaning, it is relatable to someone. For every poem that overindulges in spacing to convey an unimpactful message, there is learning, both for the poet and the reader. Some of us who felt apart from the poetry world before the new mainstream surge felt jealousy when Rupi Kaur made her success through Instapoetry. I certainly did. As an artist too, I can admit that it's similar to looking at an abstract painting that's all one color, worth thousands of dollars, and going, I could do that. Why is it so special? I read Rupi Kaur's Milk and Honey, which broke financial gains we never thought modern poetry could, and I read The Sun and Her Flowers. As with many critics who hated their own exclusion from poetry, and someone whose seemingly random success, I did so out of spite, not gonna lie. That said, in reading those collections I found what should be a praise to the Instapoetry genre. Poetry is about growing. I found Milk and Honey mediocre, but I also saw the tidbits of content that must have resonated with mainstream media. You can't get deep with 140 characters to limit yourself. Even if you do, all of them aren't going to be masterpieces. Did we study classical poetry a collection at a time? No, actually. We studied poetry one at a time. One poet with one poem with one theme. The fact that we expect to be wooed by every poem in a personal poetry collection is pretty outrageous. If this is poetry made for modern regulated consumption, how can we put those standards on a creator? Although I find the majority of Instapoetry subpar, I can't lay my fist down and demand more or condemn them for trying. Let the door open. If you are still jaded towards Instapoetry's simplicity, there's a silver lining. For every new person introduced to poetry through this easily relatable form of storytelling, there becomes a fan. We're all literary fans. We all seek more, better words to sink our teeth into. Instapoetry is a necessary evil. It is designed to open the door to all the new, beautiful, poetic voices that deserve to be heard and never had a platform to do it. Take what you want from poetry and just leave the rest behind. This applies to all poetry, old and new. Open your heart, accept the change, push for what you want from it. And let me leave you with this. What terrifies me most is how we foam at the mouth with envy when others succeed, but sigh in relief when they are failing. Quote by Rupi Kaur, Milk and Honey. So that is a pretty basic rundown of how I feel about Instapoetry. I will have more to discuss about it later when it comes to certain poets that I feel like are using Instapoetry as a cash grab rather than a form of anything literary or meaningful, but that doesn't mean that all Instapoetry, just because it's simple, is a matter of that. I think that a lot of Instapoets just don't have quite as much to say or have as complicated ways to say it, and therefore we write them off as not trying hard enough, but just because somebody starts with poetry that is very simple doesn't mean they won't evolve and grow over time. They just need an opportunity to do so. Let me know in the comments below what you think about Instapoetry, or how you felt about Instapoetry during its rise, because I know that there was a lot of different ways to go about feeling about it. And all of them were valid, and I'm sure that there's some perspectives out there that I absolutely have no idea about. Like, if you have an Instapoetry account and you have found some modicum of success, what was that like for you? Did you get a lot of quote-unquote other real writers come at you very full of jealousy, or have you had a pretty positive time about it? I'd be really interested to know. As always, thank you so much for watching. Special thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me and my content, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!